These days, it seems like GMT watches are just about everywhere you look. Thanks in part to the release of movements like the NH34 and Miyota 9075, the watch industry as a whole, at pretty much every price point, has been fixated on GMT watches for the last few years. Well, what about one that has been around a bit longer than that? Welcome to Addicted to Watches. Today, we're looking at a GMT watch from Seiko when GMTs were done a bit differently. It is a pretty rare watch these days, with a not so average movement and a very striking look. This is the Seiko SCFF009. What is a GMT watch though? I'd say 99% of you out there can already answer that question, but for those of you in the 1%, it's a watch with an extra fourth hand that lets you track a second time zone as it makes its way around the dial once per 24 hours instead of 12. Generally, it's used in combination with a bezel, internal or external, that has 24 hours marked. With those modern movements I mentioned earlier, you can adjust that fourth hand independent of the main time to track a time zone of your choosing, but this watch achieves the same functionality a bit different. The reason for this comes down to the movement inside, the 4S12, with a fourth hand that matches the main time. The 4S series of movements were some of Seiko's higher end movements based on older King Seiko movements, and lived a brief but influential life in the brand's lineups, finding themselves in Alpinists, Laurels, and Creedors to name a few. Aside from having a higher beat rate and nicer finishing, another little quirk of this movement is that it actually hand winds in two positions. Most watches will hand wind when the crown is pushed in. This one does, but it also winds the movement when you pull out the crown to the first position, the date setting position. So, if you haven't worn it in a while and need to set the date, when you do so, you'll encounter a bit of resistance as you do, because you're also winding the movement at the same time. When I first got this watch, I didn't actually know that and thought the movement was broken. It's not something I'd ever heard of before, and haven't come across since. Okay, we got a little sidetracked. The GMT function, right? That fourth hand is slaved to the main time, so when the main hands show 12, the GMT hand will only ever be pointing straight up at 24 or straight down at 12, depending on whether it's midnight or midday. That's not very useful on its own, but if you actually turn that crown down at 4, the inner bezel rotates to let you align it for a different time zone. So, if I turn it like this, the main time still says 10 past 10, but the GMT hand now displays 10 past 8, which happens to be the time in Japan now. All of that was either very interesting or not at all, depending on how passionate you are about the GMT function. Either way, taking a closer look at the watch, and starting with the dial, we have an incredibly vibrant blue dial. What makes it so striking is the combination of a brilliant sunburst with a subtle fume effect. The center of the dial is a much lighter aqua blue, but gradually fades to a richer royal blue, conveniently just in time to match that inner bezel. Depending on how the light is hitting it, that inner sunburst can change from sky blue to an almost sea blue, with a green tint. Thankfully, it's not too overdone, and while clearly being very eye-catching, isn't so over the top that it looks gaudy. The dial itself is mostly printed, with just 4 applied markers at the cardinal points. These are high-polished triangles pointing inwards with small loomed squares on the outside. These two are the only pieces of loom on the dial, with all other hour markers and minute tracks simply printed in white. I say simply, but the printing here has actually been done very well, with lots of fine lines and details. Above the pinion is the Seiko logo, and automatic printed in white, while underneath we have the only pop of colour on the watch in the form of a red S. That S is the marker that this watch comes from Seiko's SUS or SUS collection. This was a collection of watches designed as tools with an emphasis on legibility and often borrowed design inspiration from military watches. The SUS moniker comes from the combination of the words simple and strong, combined by the mathematical symbol U, representing the union of the two. Down a little past the 4 o'clock is a window cut out to reveal the date. There is no frame or bevel finish to this window, though the sides look like they might be ever so slightly rounded. Seiko went with a black date wheel here, which probably stands out less than a white one would. Keep in mind, this watch came from a long time before the masses were calling for perfectly colour-matched date wheels, something that Seiko still doesn't always give us. Surrounding the dial is that inner bezel, which is quite simple. It has 1 through 24 printed, with just the evens getting numerals. This of course lets you track the second time zone with that extra hand. Speaking of hands, the main hands on the watch have all been painted white to maximise legibility, and each is distinctly different. The hour hand has been completely squared off, while the minute hand is much more slender and arrives at a pointed tip. The seconds hand, the simplest of all, is just a needle making its way around the dial. The GMT hand on this watch has interestingly not been painted white, and instead is all polished. It's also mostly hollow until it reaches a pointed tip, which has been filled with lume. That design choice makes it hard to actually tell at a glance where that hand is. Many GMT watches you see really emphasize the extra hand, but here Seiko are downplaying it. I don't mind it if I'm honest. If I'm just glancing at my watch, odds are I'm checking my local time. And if I do want to know the time in the second time zone I'm tracking, I'll do it more intentionally, so I'll look a bit more carefully. In that way, I've mostly just used this as a 3-hand watch, and not really bothered much with a second time zone. Covering all of that is a very nice piece of crystal. It is just mineral, not sapphire, which is not so nice. But what is nice is the gentle doming. It has clearly seen its fair share of wear over the years from the marks it has, but I don't think that takes away from the effect at all. You do get a fair bit of distortion, so it is single rather than double domed. When it comes to the case design, we've got an interesting one, and that makes the measurements a bit tricky, especially with hooded lugs. Thankfully, the case diameter is a conventional 39.2mm. Height comes in at 12.5, which is not bad for a watch with a GMT, and that domed crystal extending it a bit more. There aren't lugs per se on this watch, but from tip to tip of the hooded lugs, we have a very compact 45.2mm. If you did want to change out the straps, you would be looking for an 18mm one to fit this watch. So, personally I'd stick with the bracelet. The case itself is pretty unique. Up front is a standard polished bezel, but from there the case extends quite far and quite sharply downwards from the top and bottom to form hooded lugs. If that wasn't enough, Seiko decided to add this divot on each end to give it a vague appearance of having lugs. This top surface has been brushed, but turning the watch to its side, we're presented with more polishing. Here you can see just how much the case angles downwards, which really helps it to hug the wrist. At 3 is the main crown, and at 4 is the crown to operate the inner bezel. I'm not sure if it was originally like this, or if mine has loosened over time, but there is very little resistance when turning this one to adjust the time zone you're tracking. It would have been very easy to accidentally knock or bump it, and move the bezel a few degrees either way. This crown also doesn't screw down, so there's no way to lock your bezel in position. Turning the watch over completely, and we can see something that does screw down, the caseback, which is a display caseback. Through it you can get a peek at the 4S12 movement inside. I talked about this quite a lot earlier, so I won't repeat myself here. Being a GMT watch, it seems like Seiko felt the need to remind you about it by printing this world map over the caseback and obscuring the view into the movement. Printed in red and very hard to see are some basic specs of the watch too. One more thing to talk about here is the bracelet. It actually flares out to about 20.5mm at the case, which balances the overall proportions nicely, and gives the watch more presence than a straight 18mm bracelet would have. It was a good choice here. The bracelet itself is solid, and is something like an elongated beads of rice bracelet in its design. The top surface has been completely brushed while the sides are polished, matching the case. By the time it gets to the clasp, it tapers pretty drastically to 15.8mm, and I like it. The case sides angle inwards quite dramatically, and the taper on the bracelet feels like an extension of this. The clasp is simple and gets the job done, but won't win any awards. It's completely pressed inside and out, has 3 positions for micro adjustment, and has the brand logo stamped into the security foldover. It's not big and bulky, which is a plus for me, and I think it suits the overall feel of the watch. With that out of the way, let's get it on wrist and see how it wears. On my 7-inch wrist, it sits really nicely. The shape of the case and the way it angles down can make it look a little taller than it actually is, and though it may look top heavy, it's not moving at all as I turn my wrist. As I'm doing that, you get a look at the sunburst dial in action as it changes with the light. It has presence, but I'd say it still wears pretty close to the 39mm case size. Legibility was never going to be a problem with those painted white hands as well. From all but the most extreme angles, you can easily get a read of the time before the distortion from the crystal kicks in. So, what we've got here is an interesting model from Seiko's history that has flown under the radar and maybe even been forgotten about. In a time when GMT watches are all the rage, and have been for the last few years, a watch that was doing it before it was cool would, you'd think, have come to the attention of more people, especially when it has a unique, striking design like this one, and a better than average Seiko movement inside. It could be the fact that these aren't as common as some of your other JDM cult classics, and are not nearly as readily available, but if you do find one, it's something a bit more special you can add to your collection. What do you think about this watch? Had you seen this or other SUS watches from Seiko before? Do you think it's not technically a GMT when that fourth hand isn't adjustable? Is the design a little too different for you? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you next time.